There are plenty of videos out there about Death Valley National Park, including the one we released last week about the 10 essential tips you need to know before you go.
But in this video, we're going to share with you 9 more practical tips that no one told us in any of their videos when we were doing research for our own trip that can turn out to make a big difference.
Hi, I'm Adam.
And I'm Phoebe.
And we're the couple behind In the Great Wide, and we visited Death Valley National Park in April, on my birthday, right as the peak season came to an end. So I think we got a decent feel for what it's like in both the busy winter months and scorching summer months.
Yeah, what time of the year you visit Death Valley is going to dramatically change your experience, but you'll also be impacted by what time of the month you go.
Tip number 1, you probably haven't heard before: plan your trip when there will be a new moon.
Death Valley is a certified dark sky park, which means there are practically 0 streetlights and 0 light pollution, so stargazing is one of the biggest draws to go there.
The moon was only half full when we went, a waxing gibbous for my fellow moon nerds, and we were astounded by how bright it was.
It was as if there was a street lamp in the sky.
Yeah, we didn't even need flashlights to walk from our campsite to the bathrooms or anything. It felt crazy, but because of the light pollution from the moon, we couldn't see the stars.
Yeah, it was a big bummer. Adam was really looking forward to stargazing for his birthday in Death Valley, but we could only see a few of the brightest stars.
There are a ton of websites and apps where you can track the moon phases and where the moon and the Milky Way will be in the night sky at what time of year. These apps are used all the time by photographers.
Yeah, so if you know of one that you like, please add it in the comments so everybody can find it.
Tip number 2 also has to do with the stars. Download a stargazing app.
Apart from planning your trip when you'll actually be able to see the stars, having an app to help you identify them is even better.
I use one called Skyguide that works even without a cell signal. So it is available 24 hours a day. You just pick it up, point at the sky.
And tip number 3 is once you are in Death Valley National Park, go to the Furnace Creek Visitor Center first thing.
This is where you can pay your entry fee and get your free paper map that we talked about in our last video that is super helpful.
The other nice thing about the Visitor Center is that you get to learn about the history of the park and the wildlife that still lives there.
You'll have a much greater appreciation for everything you see in the park if you know a little about the history of how the landscape formed and about the miners who worked there in the 1800s.
And knowing about the wildlife is important to keep yourself safe. However, not all the wildlife is really talked about at the Visitor Center. So tip number 4 is to learn a little about the wildlife before you visit.
There is a surprising amount of wildlife in Death Valley.
We were woken up each morning by birds at our campsite, and we also saw a large coyote sprint across the campground in the middle of the night when we were sitting at our campfire and everybody else around us had already gone to bed.
Yeah, it didn't seem like he was looking for trouble or anything. He was just passing, but it was just like, hey, look at that big shadow running across the camp.
There was nothing we could do, but we were just kind of like, oh.
Yeah, let him go by.
Yeah. And something else we saw, though, that you need to be very aware of are snakes. And before you freak out and decide you're just not going to go to Death Valley, know that not all of the snakes are venomous.
The one that we saw at our campsite turned out to be a Great Basin gopher snake, so it was entirely harmless to us. Looks very much like a Great Basin rattlesnake, but has no rattle and is not venomous.
And I think they're smaller. They won't bother you unless you provoke them.
Yeah.
However, there are rattlesnakes in Death Valley, so you need to be aware of them.
Yeah, be very aware because the rattlesnakes will kill you.
Yes, but again, only if they're provoked, if you're in their territory.
Yeah.
Which you especially need to be aware of
Right.
when you're visiting the Mesquite Flat sand dunes, because there are nocturnal animals that burrow in the sand there, especially around the shrubbery.
Yeah, we didn't see any signs of wildlife when we were on the dunes, but it's important to know that they're around and what to do or not do if you see them.
And while we are on the topic of wildlife, tip number 5 is to check inside your shoes before putting them on.
If you live in the desert, you probably already know about this, but if you're from the Midwest, like I was, this might come as a slight shock.
There are critters in the desert that like to burrow, and the inside of your sneakers looks just like a burrow.
Even if you're staying indoors at one of the resorts, you should check inside your shoes every time before you put them on, just to be safe.
Tip number 6 has more to do with planning your trip, which is to take a 4x4 SUV, preferably a hybrid with off-roading tires.
Even though we stuck to the most popular attractions because it was our first time there, they're mostly off of paved roads, but not all of them were.
We were glad to have an SUV for the rough dirt/gravel road up to Mosaic Canyon, and we were really glad to have 4-wheel drive on 20 Mule Team Canyon.
We saw a lot of people in camper vans and RVs at our campground, but these would not make it on 20 Mule Team Canyon, and I think you'd have to be really lucky to make it on those rough roads like the one that we took to Mosaic Canyon.
Yeah, we physically and I think audibly cringed when we saw a couple of sedans on those roads.
Yeah.
So whatever you were planning on driving to Death Valley, if it isn't an SUV, I highly suggest switching.
Don't take your Mustang to Mosaic Canyon, trust me. We actually rented an SUV on Turo for $55 a day, so it doesn't have to be crazy expensive.
And we also recommend a hybrid if you can find one, because you'll be driving a lot in Death Valley and gas there is expensive. So you'll want something with good gas mileage, but a high enough clearance that you won't be pooping your pants on those bumpy dirt roads.
Man, they are bumpy. This is even more important if you're planning on going to some of the lesser known attractions.
And speaking of rough roads, tip number 7 is to check the National Park Service website for road closures before your trip.
Crazy weather conditions in Death Valley mean the roads consistently need repairs.
And sometimes it's so bad that floods, yes, floods in Death Valley will completely wash out a road.
Since I know you've already watched our other video about the 10 essential tips you need to know before you go to Death Valley, as you're pre-planning your activities, make sure you check the National Park Service website for road closures because there might be one or more attractions you simply can't get to.
We'll put a link in the description to the road closures page on their website so it's easy to find.
Tip number 8 also has to do with roads because you should really study maps of the park before you get there.
Do not rely on Google Maps.
I feel like we say this in every video we make about Death Valley, but there is no cell service in the park.
Yeah,
None.
We were able to get service at the visitor center, but that was it.
And it wasn't good service. Like when we were trying to look up the snake, it took forever.
Yeah, so at the very least, you need to know how to get to the visitor center once you're inside the park, where you can pick up that free paper map that we mentioned.
You can also try downloading offline maps from Google, but even that wouldn't always load on our phones while we were in the park, so we don't recommend relying on that either.
And also, don't rely on Google Maps to know about road closures in the park. At the time we're recording this, the road to Scotty's Castle has been closed for months, but Google Maps will still tell you to drive on it.
You can also ask the rangers at the visitor center about road conditions if you're unsure when you get there.
We just can't stress enough that you should not rely on Google Maps to get around inside Death Valley National Park.
Google Maps is great, but not inside Death Valley. And last, but definitely not least, tip number 9, check your car's brakes to avoid a fire.
Yeah, we hadn't heard of this even after visiting Death Valley until we were researching resources and statistics for this video series. And apparently, a few vehicle fires happen in Death Valley every year because of brakes overheating while you're going down steep grades.
It's more likely to happen in the summertime, obviously, and happens most often to semis that are bringing supplies into the stores, but it has happened to visitors hauling camper trailers and even individual cars too.
You can help prevent it by making sure your brake pads aren't worn down before your trip, and there's other stuff you can do too if you're really worried about it, but I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I know what I'm talking about with cars, so if you have any good resources about this, please leave them in the comments for everyone.
Death Valley is made up of lots of mountains and the valleys between them, so you're constantly going up and down in elevation while you're driving around.
Yeah, just be aware that riding your brakes on those downhills could end up costing you very dearly, so if you smell something burning, pull over and get out of your car immediately.
If you've made it this far, I'm assuming it's because you learned something from this video, so please give us that thumbs up and subscribe to the channel to join our community of travelers.
And if you've already been to Death Valley, tell us your other tips that you wish you would have known before your first time going there in the comments so we can all learn from each other.
Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the Great Wide somewhere.